Some people believe the most powerful men are the ones who never cry. They are wrong. The strongest man I ever met broke down because a 6-year-old girl politely asked a question no one else had dared to ask in 7 years. Every Friday night at exactly 7 o'clock, I sat at the same corner table in Belamonte, an old Italian restaurant tucked between polished office towers in Lower Manhattan. The staff never needed to ask what I wanted. Black coffee after dinner. Sparkling water with lemon. A medium-rare filet. The chair across from me remained empty. It wasn't reserved. It wasn't broken. It was simply untouchable. Everyone in the restaurant knew that. New servers learned it during their first shift. Regular customers never questioned it. Even children somehow sensed they shouldn't wander near that table. Maybe it was because of the men in dark suits standing quietly near the entrance. Maybe it was because silence seemed heavier around me than around everyone else. Or maybe loneliness has a way of making people keep their distance. Rain drifted softly against the tall windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of silver and gold. Jazz floated through hidden speakers, gentle enough to disappear beneath the clink of glasses and quiet conversations. I stared at the untouched wine glass sitting in front of the empty chair. 7 years. 7 years since anyone had occupied that seat. 7 years since I had promised myself it would always belong to the only woman I had ever truly loved. My fork rested untouched beside my plate. Food had become routine long ago. Eating filled time. It never filled the silence. Antonio, the restaurant owner, approached carefully with fresh coffee. His smile carried the familiar kindness of someone who had long ago stopped trying to fix another person's grief. "Anything else tonight, Mr. Romano?" I looked toward the rain-covered window instead of answering immediately. "No, thank you." He nodded once and quietly disappeared. The room settled back into its comfortable rhythm. Then I heard tiny footsteps. Not hurried, not frightened, just light little footsteps moving across polished hardwood. I didn't look up at first. Parents usually called their children back before they wandered too far. But these footsteps kept coming until they stopped beside my table. A small voice broke the silence. "Excuse me, sir?" I lifted my eyes. A little girl stood there wearing a yellow raincoat that looked one size too big. Damp curls framed her pale face, and bright blue eyes studied me with the fearless curiosity only children possess. She couldn't have been older than 6. In both hands, she carried a coloring book covered with cartoon animals. One pink crayon rested behind her ear like a pencil. One of my security men took a single step forward. I raised one finger without looking at him. He stopped immediately. The girl didn't notice any of it. She simply smiled as though we had known each other forever. Then she pointed toward the empty chair across from me. "Sir," she asked softly, "can I sit here with you?" For a moment, I simply looked at her, convinced that someone would rush over, apologize, and lead her back to her family. No one came. The little girl stood patiently beside the table, her small fingers wrapped around the edge of her coloring book while rainwater dripped from the hem of her yellow coat onto the polished hardwood floor. She was not nervous. She was not demanding. She was simply waiting for an answer, as though asking complete strangers to share dinner was the most natural thing in the world. Around us, the restaurant grew unusually quiet. I noticed waiters pretending to polish glasses while watching from a distance. Antonio froze behind the espresso machine. Even my security team exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen politicians hesitate before speaking to me. They had seen billionaires rehearse conversations in their heads before approaching my table. Yet this little girl had crossed the room without a second thought. I found myself asking the first question that came to mind. "Where are your parents?" She smiled and pointed toward the front window. "Mom is outside talking on the phone. She looks sad today, and I do not like it when grown-ups look sad." Her answer caught me off guard. Most children would have answered where their mother was standing. She answered how her mother felt. There was a difference. I glanced toward the rain-streaked glass and saw a young woman standing beneath the restaurant awning with her back turned toward the street. One hand held a phone to her ear while the other rested against her forehead. Even from this distance, I could see exhaustion in the way her shoulders slumped. She never once looked inside. She had no idea where her daughter had wandered. I looked back at the empty chair. 7 years of silence seemed to gather around it. Countless people had respected that invisible boundary without ever understanding why. This child could not possibly know what that chair meant, and somehow that innocence made it impossible to be angry. I slowly reached for the chair and pulled it back a few inches. The sound echoed much louder than it should have. "You may sit," I said quietly. Her face lit up with a smile so bright that the gloomy evening suddenly felt warmer. She climbed onto the chair without help, carefully placing her coloring book on the table as though she had been invited into someone's home instead of interrupting a stranger's dinner. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "My name is Lily." "Vincent," I replied before realizing I had introduced myself without thinking. She repeated my name softly, testing each syllable. "Vincent sounds important." I almost laughed. It had been years since anyone had described my name that way. She opened her coloring book and searched through a small box of crayons. After a few seconds, she frowned. "I lost my blue one." Before I could respond, Antonio appeared beside the table carrying a brand new box of crayons. He placed them in front of Lily with the careful respect usually reserved for expensive wine. "These might help," he said warmly. Lily looked up with wide eyes. "Thank you." Then she turned back toward me as if everyone else in the room had disappeared. "Would you color with me? My mom says coloring is easier when you have company." I stared at the untouched steak cooling on my plate, then at the fresh crayons waiting between us. Somewhere deep inside a door I had locked years ago shifted ever so slightly. My fingers rested on the unopened box of crayons longer than they should have. It was such a simple request, almost absurd in its innocence. I had negotiated business contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars without hesitation. I had made decisions that changed the futures of entire companies before finishing a cup of coffee. Yet somehow choosing a blue crayon felt impossibly complicated. Lily solved the problem for me. She slid the box closer until it gently bumped against my hand. "You can have your favorite color first," she said with complete seriousness. "That is how sharing works." I looked down at the bright rows of crayons arranged inside the cardboard box. Colors I had not touched since childhood. Without thinking, I reached for the dark green one. Lily smiled as though I had passed an important test. "Green is good," she whispered. "It means things keep growing." She opened her coloring book to a blank page instead of one of the printed pictures. "I like making my own stories better." She began drawing slow, careful circles while humming quietly to herself. Every few seconds, she glanced at my paper to make sure I was still coloring. I had no idea what to draw. Finally, I sketched the outline of a tree. It was rough and uneven, but she nodded approvingly. "Trees are nice because they stay even when seasons change." The words settled somewhere deep inside me. Children were not supposed to speak like that. They were supposed to worry about cartoons and birthday cakes, not seasons and staying. "Who told you that?" I asked softly. She shrugged without looking up from her drawing. "Mom says people leave sometimes, but love is supposed to stay. So I think trees are like love." My chest tightened before I could stop it. Across the table, Lily continued coloring with complete concentration, her little tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth every time she worked on a difficult line. The restaurant slowly returned to life around us. Glasses clinked again. Soft conversations resumed. Yet nobody seemed willing to interrupt whatever was happening at our table. Even my security team had relaxed, though I noticed one of them quietly smiling for the first time in years. Lily finished her picture and turned it toward me. It showed a small house with smoke curling from the chimney. Flowers covered the front yard. A little girl stood beside a woman holding hands. On the other side stood a tall man wearing a blue jacket. Above all three figures, she had drawn an enormous golden sun. "That is my dream house," she explained proudly. "Mom and me already live together. The other person is just waiting to find us." I studied the drawing for several seconds. "Who is he?" She tapped the smiling man with her pink crayon. "I do not know yet." She giggled. "But he has kind eyes because Mom says kind eyes matter more than fancy clothes." I looked away before she could see my expression change. My expensive suit suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Then Lily reached into the pocket of her raincoat and carefully pulled out a folded paper star, its edges slightly wrinkled from being carried around all day. She placed it in the center of the table between us. "I make these whenever someone looks lonely," she said quietly. "You can keep it if you want. It helps people remember they are never eating alone forever." The paper star rested beside my untouched coffee like it had always belonged there. I picked it up carefully, surprised by how neatly it had been folded. The creases were sharp, each corner perfectly aligned. Small hands had taken their time making it. I turned it over and noticed tiny handwriting on one side. In uneven letters it read, "Everybody needs someone." I stared at those 4 words much longer than I expected. They should have sounded childish. Instead, they landed with the quiet weight of truth. Lily continued adding flowers around the little house in her drawing, completely unaware that she had already changed the atmosphere around the table. Mom says people smile with their mouths when they are trying to be polite, she said without looking up. But they smile with their eyes when they finally feel safe. I almost asked how a 6-year-old could possibly know something like that. Before I could speak, the restaurant door opened behind us. A gust of cool evening air swept inside, carrying the scent of fresh rain and wet pavement. Footsteps hurried across the dining room. Lily. The voice trembled with equal parts fear and relief. The little girl looked over her shoulder and smiled. Hi, Mommy. I stood as the young woman reached our table, breathing hard from searching. She looked younger than I had first thought, perhaps 29, with light brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail that the rain had begun to undo. A simple navy sweater covered her shoulders, and a canvas tote bag hung from one arm, stuffed with library books and children's worksheets. There was nothing remarkable about her clothes, yet exhaustion had a way of making ordinary people unforgettable. Her hazel eyes immediately found Lily, then shifted to me. The color drained from her face. I am so sorry, she said quickly. She must have wandered over while I was distracted. Lily, sweetheart, you cannot interrupt people during dinner. Lily looked genuinely confused, but he said yes. The young woman closed her eyes for a brief second before meeting my gaze again. I promise this has never happened before. We will leave right away. She reached gently for her daughter's hand. Before Lily could climb down from the chair, I heard my own voice speak. She was not interrupting anything. The words surprised me as much as they surprised everyone else. Grace paused, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. I appreciate your kindness, she replied softly, but I do not want to inconvenience you. I glanced at the half-finished drawing line between us. She has not finished coloring her picture. Lily's face brightened instantly. See, Mommy? Vincent is helping with the tree. Grace blinked. You introduced yourselves? That seemed like the polite thing to do, I answered. For the first time since approaching the table, a faint smile appeared on her face. It was tired, cautious, and gone almost as quickly as it arrived, but it changed her entire expression. My name is Grace Carter, she said quietly. Thank you for being patient with my daughter. I nodded once. Vincent Romano. The moment she heard my last name, something flickered across her face. Not recognition. More like she had heard it somewhere before, but could not place it. She searched my eyes for another second, then looked away. Lily tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. Mommy, can you help me color the sunshine? Grace pulled out the empty chair beside her daughter and hesitated. I looked at the chair that had remained untouched for 7 long years, then slowly pushed it a little farther away from the table, making room for another. Somehow, for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence no longer belonged to me alone. Grace lowered herself into the chair with visible hesitation, keeping one hand lightly on Lily's shoulder as though she expected someone to tell them they had stayed too long. Instead, Antonio quietly appeared with another place setting and a glass of water before disappearing again without asking a single question. The entire restaurant seemed to understand that whatever was happening at our table should not be interrupted. Lily happily resumed coloring the enormous yellow sun while humming the same tune from earlier. Grace watched her for a moment before letting out a quiet breath that sounded as though she had been holding it all evening. Thank you, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Life has been complicated lately. She usually stays close to me. I nodded. She said you looked sad. Grace smiled faintly, embarrassed. She notices everything. There was no self-pity in her voice, only the calm exhaustion of someone carrying more weight than anyone realized. I looked toward the stack of children's worksheets peeking from her canvas bag. Bright alphabet letters covered the top page beside cheerful cartoon animals. You are a teacher, I said. Her eyes widened slightly. First grade, she answered. At a public school in Queens. Lily immediately looked up with a grin. Mom teaches reading. She says books can make lonely people feel like they have friends. I glanced at the library books resting inside the bag. Most had worn covers, their corners softened from years of little hands turning pages. Grace followed my gaze and laughed quietly. Library books are cheaper than buying new ones. She stopped herself, almost apologizing for saying too much. I found myself asking another question. And you? She looked confused. Do books help you too? For a second, she did not answer. Her fingers traced the rim of her water glass before she nodded. Sometimes reading is easier than thinking. The honesty in that simple sentence lingered between us. I understood it more than she could have imagined. For years, I had buried myself in work because silence carried too many memories. Different lives, different reasons. The same escape. Lily suddenly slid her drawing toward her mother. Look, Vincent made the tree. Grace studied the sketch with genuine attention instead of polite approval. It is a strong tree, she said. Its roots must go very deep. I looked down at the uneven lines I had drawn without thinking. She had somehow seen more in them than I had intended. Maybe they have to, I replied. Storms come whether you are ready or not. Grace met my eyes for the first time without uncertainty. Something quiet passed between us, not recognition, not familiarity, simply the understanding that both of us knew what it meant to survive difficult seasons. Lily reached into her bag again and pulled out a small family photograph tucked inside a plastic bookmark. This is us at the zoo, she announced proudly. Grace laughed softly. Lily, that picture is falling apart. I barely glanced at the photograph before something caught my attention. Hanging around Grace's neck was a delicate silver pendant shaped like a tiny forget-me-not flower. My heartbeat slowed. I knew that necklace. I had not seen one exactly like it in 7 years. The room around me faded into a distant blur as memories I had spent years trying to bury quietly rose back to the surface. Grace noticed my eyes resting on the pendant and instinctively touched it with her fingertips. It was a gift, she said gently. Someone very kind gave it to me a long time ago. I have never taken it off. She smiled politely, completely unaware that in that single moment, the past I believed had ended forever had just found its way back to my table. My eyes remained fixed on the tiny silver forget-me-not resting against Grace's sweater long after she lowered her hand. It was impossible. There had only been 2 necklaces like that. I had commissioned them from a small jeweler in Brooklyn almost 8 years earlier. One had been given to the woman I had planned to marry. The other had never left its velvet box because I could never bring myself to look at it again after she was gone. I forced myself to breathe normally. It is beautiful, I said carefully. Grace smiled with quiet affection and looked down at the pendant. I have always thought so. Lily leaned against her mother's arm. Mom says flowers remember people. Grace laughed softly. I say a lot of strange things. Only the good ones, Lily corrected with complete confidence. Their easy conversation should have made me smile, but questions were beginning to gather faster than answers. I remembered the last week Emily had spent in the hospital. I remembered the nurses, the volunteers, the long afternoons when I could not always remain by her bedside because business demanded my attention. There had been a young woman who often read children's books aloud in the family lounge to comfort frightened patients and exhausted relatives. I had only seen her a few times in passing. She had worn her hair pulled back exactly like Grace did now. It could not be a coincidence. Or perhaps grief had simply taught my mind to recognize familiar faces where none existed. Who gave it to you? I asked quietly. Grace looked surprised by the question, but answered without hesitation. A patient. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Years ago, I volunteered at St. Matthew's Medical Center while finishing college. There was a young woman receiving long-term treatment. She loved these flowers because she said they reminded her that love should never disappear just because people do. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. Lily continued coloring happily, completely unaware that the room had become impossibly still for me. Grace gently touched the pendant again. Before she passed away, she asked whether I would accept it. I tried to refuse. She insisted. Her voice softened into something almost reverent. She told me that kindness should keep traveling from one person to another. I lowered my eyes to the paper star. Lily had given me only minutes earlier. Everybody needs someone. Somehow those words suddenly sounded very familiar. Do you remember her name? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Grace slowly nodded. Emily. She smiled sadly. She was one of the bravest people I have ever met. I closed my eyes for the briefest moment. 7 years disappeared in a heartbeat. I could almost hear Emily laughing across candlelight, teasing me for taking life too seriously. I could almost feel her hands slipping into mine during evening walks through Central Park. When I opened my eyes again, Grace was studying me with quiet concern. Are you all right? She asked gently. I wanted to answer. Instead, I found myself looking toward the rain outside the window, where countless droplets slid down the glass like memories refusing to stay buried. Then Lily reached across the table and placed her tiny hand over mine without saying a single word. It was such a small gesture that no one else in the restaurant even noticed. But in that silent moment, it felt as though the promise Emily had made years ago had somehow found its way back to me through the most unexpected people imaginable. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Lily continued filling the paper sun with bright yellow, humming softly as though silence had never been something to fear. I envied that. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten how peaceful quiet could sound when it was shared with someone instead of endured alone. Grace gently folded one corner of the drawing so the crayon would not smear across the page. Emily always believed people met for a reason, she said almost absent-mindedly. She used to tell me that kindness traveled farther than we ever realized. I swallowed slowly. Those were her words. Not similar words. The exact words. Emily had said them during one of the last evenings we spent together, watching the lights shimmer across the East River from her hospital room. I had never repeated that conversation to anyone. Grace noticed the expression on my face and tilted her head slightly. Did I say something wrong? No, I answered quietly. You reminded me of someone I thought I had lost. Forever. She smiled with gentle understanding rather than curiosity. Some people never really leave us. I looked down at the silver pendant again. Emily had been right. Her kindness had continued moving through the world long after she was gone. It had reached a young volunteer. That volunteer had become a teacher. That teacher had raised a little girl who believed no one should eat dinner alone. The chain of small mercies was almost impossible to comprehend. Lily suddenly reached across the table and held up her finished picture. Look! The three of us leaned closer. The tree I had drawn now stood beside the little house she had imagined earlier. Around its roots, she had added tiny blue flowers that looked surprisingly similar to the pendant around Grace's neck. The smiling man in the drawing was still standing beside the woman and the little girl, but now all three were holding hands beneath the giant golden sun. Everybody looks happier now, Lily announced proudly. Grace brushed a loose curl away from her daughter's forehead. What made you draw the flowers? Lily answered without hesitation. Because flowers grow better when somebody remembers them. My throat tightened. Children often spoke from imagination. Somehow Lily always sounded as though she were quietly repeating truths that adults had forgotten. Antonio appeared beside the table carrying 3 warm slices of apple pie. Compliments of the house, he said with a smile. No one should leave on a rainy night without dessert. Grace immediately reached for her wallet. Please let me pay for ours. Antonio shook his head before she could finish. Already taken care of. She looked toward me with obvious concern. You really do not have to do that. I know, I replied. Sometimes people simply accept kindness. For a moment she said nothing. Then she slowly nodded, as though recognizing the lesson behind the gesture instead of the gesture itself. Lily happily divided her slice into 3 uneven pieces with determined concentration. She pushed the largest piece toward me. Big trees need more pie, she explained matter-of-factly. Grace laughed so unexpectedly that even she looked surprised by the sound. It was warm, genuine, and free of the tiredness that had shadowed her face when she first walked into the restaurant. As I watched mother and daughter smiling beneath the soft restaurant lights, I realized something extraordinary had happened without any of us noticing. For the first time in 7 years, I had stopped counting what grief had taken from me and quietly started noticing what hope had placed back on the empty chair across the table. The rain had almost stopped by the time dessert plates were empty. Outside, the sidewalks reflected the city lights like ribbons of liquid gold stretching toward the horizon. Inside Bellamonte, conversations had grown softer, the evening settling into the comfortable rhythm that always arrived before closing. Lily carefully gathered her crayons one by one, making certain none had rolled beneath the table. Mom says borrowed things should always come back nicer than when you found them, she explained as she placed every crayon back into its box in perfect rows. Antonio smiled from across the room, clearly pretending to organize menus while secretly watching her. Grace slipped the folded drawing into her canvas bag with unusual care. I think this one deserves a refrigerator, she told Lily. Maybe even a picture frame, Lily corrected proudly. Then she turned toward me with the thoughtful expression she always wore before asking an important question. Can I show you something? I nodded. She climbed down from her chair and reached into the front pocket of her little raincoat. For several seconds, she searched carefully before pulling out a tiny white envelope decorated with uneven blue stars drawn in crayon. I made this yesterday, she said. I did not know it was for you until tonight. She placed the envelope gently beside my coffee cup as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. Grace looked puzzled. Lily, what is that? A letter, she answered simply. Sometimes words are easier when people read them instead of hearing them. I looked at the small envelope resting in front of me. My name was written across the front in large, uneven letters. Vincent. Nothing else. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single folded sheet of notebook paper covered in careful handwriting. Some letters leaned sideways. Others floated above the lines. Every sentence carried the determined effort of a child still learning to write. I began reading silently. Dear Vincent, I think you forgot how to smile before I met you. That is okay because sometimes people forget important things. Mom says hearts can get tired. I think maybe yours was tired for a long time. If somebody you love is in heaven, they probably still want you to laugh sometimes, because laughing does not mean you stopped loving them. It just means you are carrying their love with you. If you ever eat dinner alone again, remember there is always room for one more friend. Love, Lily. The words blurred before I reached the bottom of the page. I blinked once. Then again. It did not help. A single tear slipped onto the paper before I realized what had happened. I had spent years believing grief meant staying strong. Believing silence honored the people we lost. Yet this little girl had gently shown me something no one else ever had. Love was never meant to become a prison. Across the table, Lily watched me with quiet concern. She did not ask why I was crying. She simply slid her tiny paper star closer to my hand. Grace remained completely silent, understanding that some moments should never be interrupted by explanations. I carefully folded the letter and placed it inside my jacket pocket directly over my heart. Thank you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lily smiled with complete certainty. I knew you would keep it safe. For the first time since Emily left this world, the tears on my face did not feel like proof of everything I had lost. They felt like permission to begin carrying love forward instead of carrying sorrow alone. Grace and Lily stood near the restaurant entrance pulling on their coats while the last few guests quietly gathered their umbrellas. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean beneath the glow of Manhattan streetlights. I remained by the table for another moment, my hand resting over the letter inside my jacket pocket. For 7 years I had walked out of Belamonte carrying the same unbearable silence. Tonight that silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was full of voices, memories, and the unexpected kindness of two people who had entered my life without asking for anything in return. As I approached the entrance, Lily reached for my hand as naturally as though we had been saying goodnight for years. Do not forget your star, she reminded me. I smiled and slipped the folded paper star beside her letter. I will keep both. She nodded with complete satisfaction. Good. Stars help people find their way home. Grace adjusted Lily's hood before looking at me with quiet gratitude. Thank you for giving her your time tonight. She talks to everyone, but somehow she knew you needed a friend. I looked toward the rain-soaked sidewalk before answering. I think I was the lucky one. Grace lowered her eyes for a second, then smiled. Maybe we both were. Antonio held the front door open as cool evening air drifted inside, carrying the fresh scent of rain and spring flowers from the planters lining the sidewalk. My driver had already brought the car around, but I made no move toward it. Instead, I watched as Grace took Lily's small hand and started walking toward the subway entrance a block away. They laughed about something too quiet for me to hear. Lily suddenly stopped, turned around, and waved both arms high above her head. Good night, Vincent. I raised my hand in return. Good night, Lily. She cupped her hands around her mouth. Next Friday? Grace looked surprised by the question, then glanced at me apologetically. Before she could answer, I heard myself say, if your mother says yes. Lily looked up hopefully. Grace laughed, the sound bright and effortless beneath the city lights. I think that can be arranged. They continued down the sidewalk until the crowd gently swallowed them from view. Long after they disappeared, I remained standing outside Belamonte watching the place where they had last been. My head of security quietly stepped beside me. He had worked with me for nearly a decade and understood better than anyone how much had changed in a single evening. "Sir," he said, carefully, "shall we head home?" I looked back through the restaurant window at the corner table. 2 chairs now stood pulled away from it instead of one. Crayons still rested near the center beside a forgotten paper napkin folded into the shape of a flower. I smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time I understood it no longer had to be the only thing I carried. "Yes," I answered softly. "It is time." As the car pulled away from the curb, I reached into my pocket one last time and unfolded Lily's letter beneath the passing city lights. Her words looked exactly the same, yet they somehow felt even truer than before. Love had never asked me to stop living. It had only asked me to keep giving. Sometimes an empire changes because of power. Sometimes a life changes because a little girl politely asks for an empty chair. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding the family you lost. It is recognizing the family that kindness quietly places in your path when your heart is finally ready to welcome them.